Ivette. As I was thinking last weekend about what I wanted to tell you about my travel experiences, I realized it would be very difficult to be brief enough because walking for me seems to be connected to the entire of my life. I almost felt I needed to tell you my life story. Mm-hmm. I will try to narrow it down a little bit. First, let me say that as a long-distance walker, I am a novice. I'm really very new to the actual walking part. I have done 3 long-distance walks, each of them about 300 miles, which I'll tell you about a little later. There are a lot of people, I have no idea how many, that have walked thousands of miles all around the country. One of my idols, a woman named Peace Pilgrim, walked from the 50s on through the late 70s, and she walked 25,000 miles. I think she walked 25,000 miles, and after that she just quit counting. So I'm just getting started. But with each of my walks, I've gathered more of what I call wander skills and accumulated ideas about new kinds of walks I want to do and gain enthusiasm. And so my wish now is to gradually be able to walk longer and longer times and work less and less and travel in vehicles less and less, which I do a lot of still now. But the actual walking is just a piece of a lifestyle that's evolved over a very long period of time in my life. So I feel I need to back up a little bit and tell you something about that. Starting maybe in 1974 would be a good time. In 1974, I was living in Iowa City, Iowa, with my 2 daughters. And all 3 of us are lesbians. We were living there in a lesbian community. And by 1974, they were ages 13 and 14, and already had lived a year away from me in women's households, and were close to being self-supporting. So I realized in that year that they really didn't need me there anymore. That in fact they might even be better off if I weren't there, since they were just entering those difficult teenage years. I was a little nervous about leaving my mother, but as it turned out, my daughters gave her the help she needed. So I decided to leave Iowa City. I was working as a secretary in a medical complex, and I quit my job, and that was the last real job with benefits and all that I have had in my life. I left, I sold all my things. I already didn't have very many possessions, but I had a big library. I got rid of that, most of it, and moved to San Francisco. And there I discovered temporary agencies. And that's how I started earning my living, was working for temporary agencies, which took a big cut out of my salary, but in return I got a lot of freedom and flexibility. And had a lot of time to do political work, which I was doing in those days. At that point in my life, a lot of women's movement work. And also to travel. And at that point I just had this sort of inarticulate desire to wander around. I guess wanderlust is what you'd call it. I just wanted to wander. And so I would take long bus trips around the country. And another wonderful thing in those years about the women's movement was that a lot of women were living in households and kept those households open for women that were traveling. Wow. And so it made it a lot easier than it had ever been before for women to travel, and I took advantage of that. Traveled around a lot. Met a lot of women doing that.
Could I ask you, how old were you when you were in San Francisco?
Okay, at that point I was 35. Already middle-aged, so I guess you could say I was a sort of middle-aged hippie at that point. And then I started hitchhiking, which was even a cheaper way to travel. And first I hitchhiked with a friend cross country from Boston to San Francisco, and then began to hitch by myself. During that period I felt a lot of fear about my personal safety, and I purchased a gun and learned to shoot it and carried it around with me when I was walking the city or when I was traveling. But after a while, I didn't like the way that felt. And I felt that I'd probably get nervous and shoot myself or shoot some poor beggar that was coming toward me for a handout. And also that I was just by depending on that gun, I wasn't developing other methods of protecting myself.
Did you feel safe with it while you had it?
And I think I never did really feel quite safe. It wasn't working for me. So I put it in a big plastic bag with a rock and dumped it into the East River. I didn't want anybody else to have it either. And I did start thinking about other ways just to stay safe. And the most important ways that I've developed over the years have to do with my changing my attitude. And I've found that if I expect people to treat me well, in fact, they usually do. I mean, it sounds too simple, but it works. It works better than guns, I think. And the one exception to that is people with drugs, that have taken the drugs or are drunk. Those people I just avoid. But during that period of wandering around, I also conceived a longing to be closer to the natural world that I was traveling through. I wanted to be able to smell the flowers and lean my back against a tree and hear the wind whistling through the grass. And you can't do that when you're in the bus. It's almost, with all the excitement you can have traveling in a bus, I started feeling that I was just watching a string of picture postcards fly by me. The other thing that kind of pushed me in the direction of walking was that I was living in the city, and I had grown up in the country in small towns, and this was a new experience for me to see such all-encompassing artificiality with the technology. Realized it, not that that's not true in the country too, but it's just more noticeable in a city, and I started realizing that my entire life was dependent on technology. I mean, I depended on technology to get food, shelter, heat, and even depended on technology for my entertainment, movies and TV and so on. And I had no illusions that I was going to get completely free of this dependency, but I started thinking that not having a car and traveling by foot would be one way to begin de-escalating this dependence on the technology. And so that was where I was at when I planned my first walk. So in 1982, I believe it was, a group of women in northern New York State bought a piece of land that was adjacent to an arms depot where the U.S. government was storing, I'm sure, billions of dollars worth of missiles before they sent them to Europe. These women bought the land adjacent to the arms depot and set up a women's peace camp. And that particular summer, thousands and thousands of women poured into that peace camp, and for festivities to celebrate life, but also to protest the weapons that were in the arms depot. And I wanted to go to that peace camp, and I decided that I would walk. I was in New York City at the time, and so I decided I'd walk from New York City to Seneca Falls, which was close to where the peace camp was. And that was about a 300-mile walk. And so I announced to my friends in the city that that's what I was going to do, and a lot of them just thought I was cuckoo. They couldn't imagine doing such a thing. But then a friend of mine, Lou, decided she'd join me, and there were two of us doing it. It didn't sound quite so weird then. And about 4 other friends decided to walk with us the first day. So we got our backpacks together and took a subway to the George Washington Bridge, walked across the George Washington Bridge, and immediately onto a path which heads north along the Hudson River. And it was a beautiful day, and it was everything that I wanted it to be right from the beginning. We wandered along and munched on wild raspberries and looked at all the flowers that were blooming. Eventually got off the path and onto secondary roads, and I went on up then to Seneca Falls. The last day of our walk, about 25 women from the peace camp came and joined us for that last day. And among them were about 3 Buddhist women. One of them was a Japanese Buddhist monk, who belongs to, I heard then, to a Buddhist sect from Japan that is just, that's their main concern, is to travel around the world and do peace walks around the world. And they had walked 400 miles from Boston to the peace camp. And then we heard about, and I didn't even know about all this when I decided to walk, but when they met us, they told us about a group of women that had walked 600 miles from North Carolina to the peace camp. Anyway, so the last day, a lot of the day, as we walked toward the peace camp, which was next to this arms depot, we were walking on a road that followed a big barbed wire fence that was surrounding the arms depot. And somebody suggested that we walk our last half day in complete silence. So we did that, except for the Buddhist peace chant and the Buddhist beating of their drums. It was a very moving experience. It was, we began to understand what it means to pray with your feet. And so this first walk actually turned into a peace walk, although I hadn't had any idea that that's what it was going to be. One of the wonderful things I discovered in walking was not only that I was closer to the natural world that I was traveling through, but also I met a lot of wonderful people along the way. It hadn't even occurred to me that I was also missing people when I was traveling along in my little self-contained bubbles on the bus. And a lot of women, people, men, women, children, a lot of men were very appreciative and respectful of what we were doing. The women seemed to be particularly delighted. I think because what we were doing was simple. It just seemed like something that anybody could do, that they could do if they took a mind to do it. And also old people were delighted. I think a lot of old people, more than young people who've never known anything but a world where you only travel in cars and where there's technology and permeating your life, these old people remembered when it wasn't like that. And a lot, I think there's a myth that these old people are just old fogies who are resisting the march of progress, when in fact I think they have some very important things to say that we need to listen to about the changes that we're making in our world. Also on that first walk I saw a lot, something I knew in my mind. I had grown up on farms. I knew rural life in this country was declining, but I never saw it so clearly as I did that walk. And the same has been true in subsequent walks, that we walked by many abandoned farmhouses, walked through ghost towns, talked to farmers who were struggling to hang on to little scraps of land, and all of which is related to the fact that more and more it's impossible for ordinary people to make a living growing food, that our food is grown by enormous agribusiness corporations, that the land is centralized. I mean, the farms are huge, and they're mechanized. Ordinary people can't afford the machinery. So many people over the centuries have been driven off of the land, away from their sources of survival, and jammed into overcrowded cities living in squalid conditions. So we have this insanity of vast stretches of empty land and millions of people jammed into these little spaces. Also, as part of that, we saw how the interstate system worked to increase the isolation of rural areas. I mean, the interstate system is just designed to connect the cities. And we walked a lot on secondary highways, so we saw a lot of times abandoned motels and abandoned businesses that couldn't survive once the interstate went through. Heard people talk about how the buses don't run to rural areas anymore, the trains don't run to rural areas. So that whole decline of rural life, it's scary really to see it. And we also saw the extent to which the highways are places of mass slaughter. I mean, everywhere we walked, even on secondary roads, we'd see hundreds of small animals, some large animals, birds, insects that had been killed on the highway. of course, that reminded me of, I didn't see actually any automobile accidents where people were killed, but I know for a fact that more people are killed on our highways every year than were killed throughout the entire Vietnam War. So the automobile is a killer, not to mention the pollution that it adds to. So that was that first walk.
And that was in 74?
That was 82.
82.
See, I left Iowa City in 74, so I was basically wandering around doing my whole, getting used to what it is to wander all of that time, doing my bus rides and my hitching.
Mm-hmm. Evolving. Mm-hmm. How about physically? Is it tiring? How much do you accomplish per day? Or how long does it take you to walk 300 miles?
Well, that first walk took a month. And it varies a lot. We had, that walk, we didn't actually, some of the walk we didn't carry our backpacks because we knew people along the way. So we would just we would leave the packs at our friend's house, walk, our friends would come and get us for the night, take us back to that starting point. And that's more the mode of the peace walk, which is not what I had intended, and actually is not what I've done subsequently. But most peace walks, say like the 600-mile walk of the women from North Carolina, they have a vehicle to carry their packs and their equipment and stuff. And that's nice in that it means that more people can participate. I mean, it's just sort of a different mode. Mm-hmm. But traveling myself with a heavy pack, when I'm starting out, not in shape, maybe 10 miles a day. And as I get in better shape, 15 or 16 miles a day. Mm-hmm.
The train industry, I wanted to ask you about the train industry and the automobile.
Right. So we were talking about how the automobile industry is a very powerful lobby with a large stake in having people just drive cars. And so obviously they were important in pushing through the network of interstates. And there used to be a lot of trains going to a lot of rural areas in the country. I mean, my mother's home community in northern Iowa used to have 3 trains running through it, whereas now there are no trains, and you can't even take a bus to that town. It's a small town. Mm-hmm. And so you have a lot of these, well, since there aren't that many farmers, since the land is, since food is grown by agribusiness largely, or farmers that have very large farms, that means that the little towns in the agricultural areas are also dying out because they depend on the farmers' business. So when the farmers go bankrupt, then the towns die. And I've found, and this is true in other parts of the country too, that agricultural towns basically are dying out, shrinking and dying. And our economy is so controlled by multinational corporations and by military wealth that only the towns that have corporate and military funding pouring into them are growing. And so, for instance, universities used to be, a lot of universities, as here in Amherst and Northampton, used to be located in very small towns. Those areas are growing precisely because the universities are getting a lot of military and corporate funds. And so and I know that too, just from looking for work. Those are the kinds of places I have to go to find work. Whereas I might prefer to work in a little agricultural town because the economy in those towns has no vitality. I also find myself going to the places where the corporate and the military funds have been expanding the economy, which is, to me, a distressing fact.
Mm-hmm. So you work at these places only enough to save money and maybe recoup or get ready for another walk?
Mm-hmm. That's my pattern, is just to walk or work until I have as much money as I need to go walking. And as I said, I hope to shrink the amount of time I work and increase the amount of time I walk. But, well, so after that first walk, I had some money left over, and I traveled in Central and South America for a while, and that was my first big trip. I'd been to I have family living in Costa Rica. I'd been there before, but I'd never been to South America. And at that time, I still had a fantasy of traveling around the world. I mean, traveling was so exciting to me, and I loved the idea of becoming acquainted with many different people and cultures. But somehow that trip impressed me in a way that made it impossible for me to continue in that direction. And this again was something I knew in my mind, but by traveling in Bolivia and Peru, I saw it so much more clearly that those countries are living in dire poverty, and it's absolutely related to the affluence in this country. That in fact we are rich because they are poor, and we are rich because we steal their resources and their labor. And when you add that to the tremendous extremes of wealth and poverty in this country, it's just not right. And we in the U.S. Are a small proportion of the world's population and use a huge proportion of the world's resources. So I guess I came home from that trip. I'd had a wonderful time. I loved being there, but I just couldn't feel good about it, and I decided I had to move my life even more in a direction of simplifying my life. I just felt that it didn't feel right to have more than I needed when so many people in the world had less than they needed. And I also didn't think, even if I could ignore that, I felt that somehow that doesn't work. I mean, I think our wealth is backfiring. I think we're rich. And obviously I do not mean that everybody in this country is rich, but we're a rich country. And that we're suffering from a spiritual malaise that is the result of getting our wealth at somebody else's expense. So that whole feeling worked in, also walking fit in with that experience.
What about your trip in South America? Did you do walking?
No, I didn't walk. I took a plane, and I mean, I walked somewhere
Once
there, but it was not a walking trip. But I came home wanting to walk more, feeling that I wanted to go more in that direction, walking, simplifying my life as much as possible and walking, rather than in the direction of saving a lot of money to take trips on airplanes to other countries. I mean, until then, I was kind of thinking both, but that one trip set me more in the direction of the walking. And I came home all set to take another walk, but at that point my mother's condition deteriorated, and so I went home to Iowa and spent a year helping take care of her. And during that year I met Rebecca, and we became lovers, and that was wonderful for a lot of reasons, but also because she was as excited about walking as I was. So we moved to New Mexico and worked for a while there as temporary office workers in the university, and then planned a walk for the next summer. And that walk, she was more into wilderness walking. I was more into road walking and people. So we walked about 100 miles on the Appalachian Trail, carrying really very heavy packs. And then came down out of the mountains and walked in Tennessee and Kentucky and Indiana. And what I remember, the new thing about that walk that I remember the most, is that we didn't have any friends along that route to stay with as I'd had in the first walk. So we carried our packs the whole time. And we also, we really didn't have options of other places to stay, so we had to start asking people if we could pitch our tents in their yards. And that was just an amazing experience. I mean, we found that we had tapped this wellspring of most wonderful generosity and kindness. I mean, not only people would let us pitch our tents in their yards, they would invite us in to stay in their guest rooms and fix us dinner and breakfast and send us away with fresh vegetables from their gardens. One woman insisted on doing my laundry. I mean, we spent a lot of time just scratching our heads. What's going on? This is very strange.
And this is in small towns or?
Pretty much small towns, yeah. And this was an agricultural area we were walking through. We saw a lot of the same, talked to a lot of farmers. There are a few more small farms there than there are in New England, I would say. So mostly we talked to farmers that were trying to hang on to their little scrap of land but had to have a full-time job in town in order to do it. And a lot of different kinds of people we stayed with, but we, one thing, I mean, there were a lot of reasons, I think. The main one, maybe the simple one, that people are just, can be very nice and kind. But we also realized that there's an ancient, very ancient belief that one of the worst sins you can commit is to be unkind to travelers. And that's in the Bible, all through the Old Testament, I believe. Somebody told me that the whole Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was supposedly because they had committed the sin of being inhospitable to travelers. And that's in cultures all over the world. And that's still sort of in people's minds, that that's an important thing. That if someone comes traveling along, that you should be kind to them. Of course, now the trouble is nobody comes around. So it's like we got the benefit of all the accumulated wish to be kind to travelers, I guess. But then Rebecca had to go back. She ran out of money. She had to go back to New Mexico. So I decided that was my first try at walking alone. And I wanted, and I also...
What year is this?
This is 86, maybe 87, right around there. And so I decided that I was going to try walking also without my pack and without my tent and my sleeping bag. It was very hot, and I thought I would be able to just sleep on the ground and be all right. And I was sick of carrying it, so I tried that, and I did that for a few days. And the amazing thing about that was that I discovered, by increasing my vulnerability, I simply increased the generosity of people I encountered. They were even more willing to help me out.
A woman alone, personal,
vulnerable.
Do you think that you received a lot of kindness because you were a woman? Might a man have received the same kindness?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's a common aspect of walking stories. There's a man named Peter Jenkins, I think that's the name, who's written a number of books. One is Walk Across America. And his book is full of those kinds of stories. So I think he has maybe a few more stories of his life being in danger. I just simply have never had that experience, but many stories of people being hospitable.
So you've been walking over 10 years, or?
Well, the first walk was 82. No, yeah.
Almost.
It will be, but I mean, I can hardly say I've been walking. I've been a lot. See, I haven't been able to do as much as I'd like because I've had family responsibilities that interfered. My mother died a couple of years ago, and I won't have that now.
Was she aware of your walking? And what did she have to say?
She was pretty mellow by that time.
Whatever you do is fine.
I'd done so many weird things by then. That was nothing. She was.
How about city walking? Are you interested in that at all?
Well, because I've lived in cities a lot, I do walk in cities. I mean, I found ways to walk, and I don't have a car, so just in that sense, I've walked in cities, but not as part of this other that I'm doing.
City people are sort of like the forgotten people in a way, because it's not so much that they want to be in cities, but that they need to be there because that's where their livelihood is, or if they don't know any better. And I wonder if it's important to you to meet people and share yourself with people in all areas.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I've spent a lot of time living in cities, and I don't feel that I don't want to ever be in the city. I don't have that feeling. In fact, I loved living in New York City just because I loved all the varieties of people that I met there. Yeah. And I think that is true. And I think I think what's going on in the cities is absolutely related to what's going on in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I'm concerned, it's the technology. It's like a technological juggernaut that has driven people out of the country, and made people in the country very poor, driven people into the cities with no access to provide for their own survival needs.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're more dependent on government, corporations,
Mhm.
business. That's scary.
I mean, when I'm in the city, that's what I do. I go to work, I work at machines, I come home, I play with machines. It's just, that's life. And I remember thinking when I lived in New York, if there were a really serious fuel shortage, that entire city would go hungry. Because there's no way to get food in New York City unless it's brought in trucks. And so that's part of it.
So, was there another walk after
Mhm.
that one?
Shall I go on and tell you about that?
Uh,
How are we doing for time?
well, let's see.
So the last time I walked was a year ago, last summer, and I was still living with Rebecca in New Mexico, but we decided that we would take separate walks, that each of us wanted to walk alone. We'd had a wonderful time walking together, but rugged individualists that we are, we each have our own walk styles. So
Sure.
she's very much more into the wilderness, she likes to plan all details of her walk. I like to just walk out the door and wander, and those aren't too compatible. So she planned a walk and walked in the Rockies, and I also had a lot of friends that I wanted to visit, so I took a bus all around from Florida up to New York City, through the Midwest to Vancouver and Seattle. Then I got off the bus and started walking in northern Washington, and walked through Washington State and down the coast into Oregon. And in Oregon, I got lost in the rainforest, and I was lost for 2.5 days, which is another whole story, which I won't go into. But it was a pretty harrowing experience. I've never been so frightened, I think, in my
Why?
life. Why was I frightened?
Yes.
Because I was lost. I was in the middle of this forest, and I had no idea how to find my way out. And finding my way out was like finding a needle in a haystack. I mean,
Sure.
the rainforest is very dense. But I did find my way out, and I was exhausted. So I, at that point, stopped walking and went and stayed with a friend in Eugene, recuperated. And by that time, Rebecca was tired of walking alone too, so she came and joined me, and we walked on down the coast through the redwood forest, which was wonderful, exciting, and visited friends in San Francisco. And then it was a very hot summer. Some of the places we were walking toward were 108 degrees. So we decided we'd go to Vermont and hope we could do some more walking.
Cool
It was
down.
cooler, but it wasn't. It was hot. I had never been so hot, I think, in my life as in Vermont that summer. So we walked a few more weeks, and we had some good times because Vermont is gorgeous walking country, but we finally admitted it was too much. It was too hot, and so we quit.
What
So
type
that
of
was
clothing do you wear? Sneakers?
Just sneakers, yeah. I don't like big walking boots. They're too heavy. And
They could get your feet hot.
I don't
So you walked during the summer because the weather is better.
I like to, and I ideally, once I hopefully walk longer walks, the ideal is to just follow the weather. And so what I'm planning now for April 1st is that I'll start in central Florida, maybe from around Tampa, and walk north with the spring. So obviously the spring comes a little later, the further in each state as you walk north.
So, and you think this will take you into the summer?
Mm-hmm.
June?
Well, when I set out, I don't set out with any expectations. I'm not doing this to prove anything to anybody.
Mhm.
It's not an endurance test.
Mhm.
So I figure I'll just walk as long as it's pleasurable. I mean, from the beginning, I've had that pact with myself.
Mhm.
I'm not doing this to suffer. I'm doing it because it gives me a lot of pleasure to be walking through the natural world, what's left of it. And if the weather just gets too much for me or I get tired, I quit. But I'm hoping I don't have, as I said, I don't have family responsibilities that are likely to shorten my walk this time. My daughters are 29 and 30 years old, and since they were on their own so young, they're very strong and independent. They don't need me now. My mother died, so I can
Well, I
walk
hope,
just as long as it's pleasurable to me, and that's what I intend to do.
Well, I hope that we could do a follow-up interview at some future date. That I'll walk wherever I need to see you, and maybe we could do that, a follow-up, because it'll be interesting to know what happens to you and where you've been and stuff.
Well, I'll send you word of what happens. I mean,
Okay.
I tell everybody if they don't hear from me, it probably means I never got off the ground at all. But I usually write a lot of letters when I'm walking. So I'll let you know what's up.
All right. So thank you.
Thank you.